what we're going to talk about is Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, some things we're going to briefly go over is how Fidel Castro and Bautista had their differences because Fidel wanted to take over his position. We're going to talk about the Pigs of Bay, Berlin Wall, and letters being sent back and forth by presidents. Concerning to this. Alrighty, so Fidel Castro tried to take over Batista because he thought under his rules Cuba would benefit much more. Now his first attempt was July of 1953. 100 men attacked the Moscadic army, which was a failure. Fidel was captured and he was sentenced to 10 years, but he only served 2. Okay, now these pictures that you're about to see, the U.S. took pictures of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I'm going to read off some following events that happened because of this. Now, it's 22nd of October. John Kennedy addressed the nations regarding to the Cuban crisis of the U.S. military, and Khrushchev announced over the radio in Moscow that he was agreed to remove the missile crisis from Cuba.
The Bay of Pig invasions took place on April 17, 1961 in southwest Cuba to trigger an anti-Castro rebellion. Rebel Cubans didn't like Castro as president because of his leadership. So the rebels tried overthrowing him, backed up by the U.S. with weapons. The mission failed because they were beaten by the Cuban armed forces. Khrushchev was Soviets' president. Soviets in Russia put missiles in Cuba, which made John F. Kennedy wonder why they would. Khrushchev did this because he didn't think the U.S. would notice until it was too late. This plan was found out when a U-2 overflighted Cuba and spotted missiles on October 14th. John F. Kennedy was America's president who tried removing Castro. The U.S. planned to destroy the sugar crops of Cuba and to assassinate Castro. Kennedy planned not to invade Cuba if Khrushchev would pledge to renounce his missiles. Khrushchev demanded the U.S. to remove missiles from Turkey by the way of trade that Kennedy agreed to in secrecy.
In May 1962, the Soviets countered America's growing lead in deploying strategic missiles by putting mid-range nuclear missiles in Cuba. Soviet leadership believed that Kennedy would avoid conflict after his lack of confidence during the Bay of Pigs invasion. The U.S. suspected Soviets of putting missile bases on Cuba by August 1962. The U.S. eventually decided to make a naval blockade around Cuba, and with the support of the Organization of American States, they sent their plan into action. They received assistance from Argentina, Venezuela, the government of Trinidad and Tobago, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic. The blockade was to keep Cuba from receiving offensive weapons, but did not affect trade. The U.S. requested a meeting with the United Nations Security Council on October 25th. The U.S. ambassador confronted the Soviet ambassador and challenged him to admit the existence of missiles on Cuba. When the Soviet ambassador refused to answer, the U.S. raised the Strategic Air Command's readiness to DEFCON 2 the next day for the only time in U.S. history.
This is the Berlin Wall. It was a barrier constructed by the German Democratic Republic, or the GDR. They began building this wall on August 13th of 1961. It completely cut off West Berlin from the surrounding East Germany and East Berlin, all by land. And I'm not exactly sure when it was completed, because I couldn't really find that. The Soviets had an insecurity and fear of losing Cuba in an invasion by the Americans. Since his coming to power, Fidel Castro had several attempts at being overthrown by the U.S. This, therefore, had the Soviets place short-range missiles in Cuba to beef up their arsenal and deter the U.S. from attacking. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, and Cuba were both communist countries. The Soviet Union provided money and supplies to Cuba during the U.S. trade embargo with Cuba. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, all aid to Cuba was cut off. Their relationship was mostly economic, and the U.S.
Two sides exchanged written letters on October 23rd, Khrushchev and Kennedy, they were sending about peaceful invasions of the Soviet Union, and also the Khrushchev, whatever, expressed October 28th his trust of the USA that could not invade Cuba.
A missile can be divided into 8 sections: radome, guidance, autopilot, dorsal fins, rocket motor, steering control, and 8 control surfaces. The 8 control surfaces consist of 4 fins that act against air resistance to change direction of the missile. The steering control electronically charges control surfaces that change missile surfaces.